Cold War paranoia became the dominant aspect of American society during this period. Between the encroachments of Stalin and the Soviets, the Korean War, China falling to Mao and the Communists, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, particularly the Soviets getting them, there began to be a great sense in America that we were surrounded by all sides and our very existence was threatened at any moment. And all American problems began to be blamed on communist conspiracies. Anytime you saw something you didn't like, you called it a communist conspiracy. For example, when Martin Luther King will begin to ascend in the late 1950s, conservatives who oppose him are convinced that he's a Soviet agent here to destroy America. That was very common talk about just about everybody. You see it in the culture. You see it in movies. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a thinly veiled allegory for the idea that any one of your neighbors at any time could be converted to a communist. The Red Menace isn't even an allegory. It's just a horror movie where the bad guys are basically communist. You also see this nuclear anxiety with movies like Them, where radiation leads to giant ants. Again, this fear of the result of nuclear weapons. Better dead than red was a common rallying cry for anti-communists. And there were lots of books you could go out and buy about the communist conspiracy to destroy America, whether it was true or not. I want to take a minute and talk about Richard Nixon. And a lot of you know a lot about Richard Nixon, but I think one of his more underappreciated accomplishments, if you can call it that, is that he is really in many ways the father of the Second Red Scare. So let me give you a little biography on Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon served in World War II. He was a quartermaster in the Pacific, which was important, valuable work. But it wasn't as glamorous as combat. And when Richard Nixon leaves the war and returns home to Whittier, California, he decides he wants to get into politics. Now, he lies and pretends that he was a combat veteran, which he wasn't. And I don't think there's any shame in that, but there's certainly shame about lying about it. And he enters into a race against a Democrat who had been in the California legislature for a number of years, Jerry Voorhees. A congressman from California, Jerry Voorhees. Now, you have to understand the position the Republicans find themselves in by the late 1940s. Republicans are still associated with the disastrous economic collapse that became the Great Depression. You can agree or disagree with that, but in the minds of the people, that was their fault, and FDR had fixed it. Republicans were also associated with the disastrous isolationist policies that most people by 1946 see as a terrible mistake and one of the causes of World War II, and of course, almost treasonous in hindsight, although people didn't necessarily see it that way at the time. And so if you're a Republican and you're trying to run against the Democrats, it can be a little tricky trying to find a good issue. Your Republican policy had been largely discredited on both foreign affairs and economic affairs. So Murray Chotiner, a political consultant in California, will tell Nixon that he has to do something dramatic to shake up the race and give himself a chance to win. And what he advises Nixon do is simply accuse his opponent of being a communist. And so Nixon takes a imagined connection to an event that he imagines as communist, to an organization that's not even actually communist, and he begins to smear his opponent by simply accusing him of being communist. And it works. His opponent doesn't really feel the need to respond to this because there's no truth to the allegations and he doesn't know anybody cares. But what Voorhees has failed to understand is that the fear of communism has grown to the point that this is enough to cost him the election. Nixon will use this exact same trick again in 1950 when he runs for the Senate against a woman who he again lies and claims has associations with a communist organization that's not even actually a communist organization. And by using these Red Scare tactics, by smearing his opponents and calling them communists, Nixon is able to rise to the Senate by 1950. And this is a great reflection, both a reflection of the fear of communism of the period, as well as a manifestation of how that becomes used politically to promote, particularly Republican politicians in these early days, when they don't have more substantial issues to run on. Obviously, we'll be hearing a lot more from Richard Nixon later. Conservatives, Republicans, will begin to pressure the government to institute loyalty programs to root out communists hidden in our government. Truman caves, and by 1951, 2,000 federal employees have resigned under pressure of being suspected of being communist. 212 have been fired. The Federal Employee Loyalty Program launches an assault on subversion. The Attorney General compiles a list of subversive organizations. And J. Edgar Hoover, who's now the head of the FBI, investigates and harasses anyone suspected of association with these organizations with great gusto. It will be at this point that we begin pledging allegiance on a regular basis. Before, the pledge had largely been reserved only for immigrants when they became citizens. There was no other reason to say it for the most part otherwise. But by this point, it will be a loyalty pledge essentially to the United States to prove you're not a communist. Children will begin saying it daily in schools, and even at many workplaces, including many government workplaces, that you'll have to say it every day to show that you're not a communist. They also come up with the clever tactic of inserting the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, based on the mistaken belief that you can't be a communist and believe in God at the same time, and based on the even more ludicrous belief that somebody who doesn't believe in God would have a problem saying "under God," because if you don't believe in God, what are you scared of? And if you're some sort of spy, it makes no sense. But that's how the pledge becomes this kind of daily event, and that's also how the words "under God" end up in it. In 1950, the McCarran Internal Security Act requires that all, quote, subversive organizations register with the government and publish all their records. Truman vetoes this, saying that this violates the civil liberties of these groups, but Congress overrides the vetoes. It doesn't help that the Russian nuclear program is based on the work of a couple of American spies. The British scientist who ultimately gave the Russians the information they needed to build the bomb claims that he got the information from a group of Americans, the Rosenbergs. They were members of the Communist Party in the 1930s. Remember, in the 1930s, the communists had a bit of a period of acceptability here in America. Ethel Rosenberg's brother had been a machinist on the Manhattan Project and was sneaking information out and giving it to his sister, who gave it to her husband, who was giving it to Soviet agents. On April 5th of 1951, both Rosenbergs, including the wife, who's a woman, are sentenced to death and are killed on June 19, 1953. This is kind of the peak of the anti-Soviet paranoia. There's going to be a great purge in the country where anybody suspected with any connection at all to communist or socialism or any organizations that might be connected to those will be fired from jobs, universities, run out of unions, any sort of organization like that.